am not shy. I am not quiet. Well, usually. Today, my pharyngitis is really giving me a run for my money. I'm not disengaged. I'm definitely not afraid of public speaking. I'm not lonely. I'm not frigid most of the time. I am an introvert, and I work in emergency medicine. And I am not the only one. Looking at you, Megan Simon Thomas. I first took the Myers-Briggs personality test when I was in high school, and I was an extrovert. Let's back up a little bit. Science has shown significant chemical and structural differences between introvert and extrovert brains. This has led to many conclusions about how and why we think and act differently. Introverts may be described as sensitive, serious, risk-averse, and quiet, while extroverts are described as adventurous, gregarious, engaging, and decisive. Social scientists have mapped out pretty clearly that over the past 100 years, American culture has really come to celebrate and prize those typical extrovert qualities. From the way that we structure our classrooms to the way that we market our beauty products, we hold that extrovert ideal high. So high that when a young, idealistic, impressionable high school student takes a personality test to help her determine her place in the world, she may answer the questions for who she wants to be and not who she actually is. I've spent the better part of the last 20 years trying to be an extrovert and ending up in a bathtub sobbing and wondering, why am I so discontent and exhausted? A couple of years ago, I went on vacation with some close friends, and by the fourth morning in, I was starting to feel a little overwhelmed from all of the stimulation. But for the first time in my life, I didn't just try to power through. I showed up to breakfast, took the table next to my friends, announced that I didn't want to talk to anyone, and I spent the entire meal reading a novel. It was amazing. Once I determined it was okay to be an introvert in my personal life, I decided to entertain visions of what it would be like to embrace my introvert self at work. First order of business, I had to realize that being an introvert may actually help us at times in this field. As an introvert, I process most data internally. So in fast-paced situations, I may feel just a step behind. For years, I thought that my natural inclinations to think and rethink and to assess harm was a hindrance in this field. As I've spent more years as an attending, I've come to realize that sometimes the best thing we can do in a critical situation is take a moment to pause. A couple of years ago, my resident came in and said, "The guy in room 2 is really sick. I think he's going to need to be tubed soon." I went in, the patient was tachypnic, tripoding, not moving any air. The resident had already started every non-invasive intervention we had. As I stood there, watching the situation, the resident said, "Time to tube, right?" "No," I said. "Now we wait." "Wait for what?" he asked. "Well, now we wait to see what happens." He and I stood there, looking at the patient, then the monitor, back and forth, back and forth. And a couple of minutes in, the patient's respiratory rate dropped just a little bit, his breathing eased, and his skin tone started to pink up just a smidge. And I said, "That's why we wait." Research has shown that introverts are more risk-averse, and it can be tough in a field like ours where our inherent need to act decisively may necessitate assuming some big risks. But there are just as many patients that benefit when we take a moment and consider the alternatives to just the most aggressive care. All right, what else do introverts bring to the table? I'm sure you've all heard or read those studies looking at how quickly doctors interrupt a patient during the initial history. On average, it's between 12 and 18 seconds. Danielle Ofrey, an internist here in New York and author of What Patients Say, What Doctors Hear, did a great experiment one day in her clinic where she let patients just keep talking. She didn't interrupt them, she just listened. Of course, we're all imagining replicating that experiment in the ED and being stuck in exam room 8 for no fewer than 3 hours. Dr. Ofrey describes the fear that she felt when one of her more complicated and loquacious patients came in one day. Turns out, the patient only spoke for 4 minutes before she was done, nothing more to say. And you know what that patient said as she walked out of the room? "Just talking about this has made me feel so much better." Research has shown that introverts have a higher listening to talking ratio, We are hardwired to speak fewer words. That natural inclination may give us the ability to give our patients more room to speak, and in allowing them that space, we may be addressing their needs without ever having to order a test or a medicine. All right, so maybe we're good at taking a pause, and maybe we're hardwired to give our patients more room to speak. But introverts, if we are going to succeed in this business, there's a few things that we need to work on. First order of business, we need to pee more. I mean, come on, what do physicians, especially emergency medicine physicians, pride themselves on? The size of our bladders. You've all heard that story about the attending that worked at a site for 15 years and she still didn't know where the bathroom is because she never peed on shift, right? All right, so that's an exaggeration, but I am here to call for more peeing. Not because of your bladder size or concern for your kidney function, but because of what it does for your mind. It's 5 minutes of no one handing you an EKG to review. 5 minutes of not hearing a patient presentation. 5 minutes of relative silence. The bathroom is a 6 by 6 foot square of total bliss. Introverts, lose the competition for the biggest, strongest bladder. Win a moment of clarity and peace. Your mind and your patients will thank you. Go pee more, even if you don't have to. Use that. Maybe you do need to. Use that moment to close your eyes or breathe in deeply or check Facebook. You could even do a modified sun salutation in there. You probably don't want to break out your chaturanga on the ED bathroom floor, though. All right, so we need to pee more, but we also need to care less. Let me explain. I was working a shift with my program director at the end of residency, and as we walked out of the room, he said, you know, you don't have to care about every patient. He was one of the most kind and compassionate physicians I've ever worked with, so you can understand why I was confused. He went on to say, you are going to see a lot of patients over a lot of shifts for a lot of years. You don't have to fully care about each one. You can be professional and concerned and courteous without fully extending yourself. That is the only way that you are going to make it in this career. As an introvert, my relationship style is all about personal investment. Small talk can be agonizing, but getting into traumatic stories of childhood, I am totally down with that. I find myself trying to connect with patients in that way. But if I'm making that kind of a connection every 15 minutes, I am not going to have anything left by hour 3 of the shift. So now, when I find myself feeling particularly depleted at the beginning of the day, I tell myself, it's okay. Not every patient is going to be a soul connection. And for those of you early in your career, here's a word of encouragement. It gets easier. My brain is now hardwired to smile, shake hands, make eye contact, while my inner self is busy preserving my emotional investment. One last tip for the introverts in the crowd. Jump. I've mentioned already that introverts tend to be more risk averse, and that is a good thing. But as we go through life, every now and then, we're going to have to put aside that pro-con list and just go for it. I was doing a visiting rotation in Ecuador during medical school, and one weekend we ended up in this canyon high above a river below with people bungee jumping off the bridge. My friends all beelined to take their turn. I stood back and calculated the distance to the nearest trauma center. As I stood there thinking about everything that could go wrong, I realized my friends back home didn't want to hear me tell stories of watching people jump off a bridge. They wanted to hear that I had jumped off a bridge. So I put on the harness, climbed on the rail, and I jumped. Well, I stood there paralyzed with fear when the guy counted me down, so he picked me up and he dropped me off the side of the bridge. It's close enough, right? As you think about your career in emergency medicine, you may have a list of reasons why you can't go back to work in academics or why you can't go work at the trauma center. That risk of failure may be holding you back from applying to an administrative position in your hospital system. Be intentional about the choices that you're making, but remember, every now and then, your cautious side is going to need an override. And now a word for the extroverts in the crowd. Thank you. I am so grateful. That's an extra, thank you. I am so grateful for people that will fill gaps in conversation or start a, because there are so many if you talk to me, or start a discussion on a dicey topic in faculty meeting, or charge into a crashing patient's room and do something, anything to get that patient turned around. But extroverts, I am not gonna let you off the hook that easily. I love you, and I need you in my life, but you gotta remember a good amount of the people that you work with are just like me. So that resident that isn't speaking up during board prep quizzes, he may not be disinterested. He might just be analyzing some really tricky phrases. The colleague that always seems a little bit aloof on shift, they might be putting all of their emotional energy into their patient interactions and not even realize that they don't look you in the eye when you say hello. The patient that calls you back into the room, even after you've already gone over all their test results with them, because it's all happened to us, come on. They might have felt inhibited the first time you were in there and just needed a few minutes to process things before they were ready with their questions. I'm married to an extrovert, and he does not like that label. His primary concern is that when we talk about extroverts and introverts, it's very easy to take an us versus them approach. Well, that, and he thinks I use the introvert identity to get out of making phone calls for our family, which is true. My husband doesn't like being boxed into being an extrovert, and I gotta say, he has a point. He is not 100% introverted. He's not 100% extroverted. I'm not 100% introverted. And yeah, neither are any of you. So tell you what, all these tips today, they're for everybody in the crowd. Introverted, extroverted, somewhere in between. We all need to remember that it's okay to take a moment to pause, even in a critical situation. We all need to remember that it's important to be conscious about how we're budgeting our energy. And for God's sake, we all need to pee more. Thank you.